So let's start talking about this concept of validity. And I want to do two things in this lecture, or at least two main things in this lecture. One, I want to talk about what validity is, get a slightly more precise, clear idea of what we mean by validity, and also to say a bit about why valid does not mean necessarily good. Now, and I remember I was kind of fussy about that last lecture. I said, well, in ordinary speech, when you talk outside of a philosophy class or a math class and you say valid, you might just mean good argument. We mean something much more precise in philosophy. Don't use it that way here. This is important, A, just because we do need logic is, at least formal logic, is all about precision. So we need a very, very exact and precise definition of our term. But also, the way we use this term, this little bit of jargon in philosophy and logic, does not necessarily mean a good argument. An argument can be valid, and for reasons we will get into, can actually not be a good argument at all. The main way is it fails to be sound. We'll talk about what soundness means, but before that, let's get a little more precise about what we mean by validity. So look, let me give you guys a few examples, right? Trump is president of the US. We remember high school government. Well, we know that means he has to be at least 35. Valid argument. What about this one, though, right? Hopefully, you guys remember the very basics of high school government. I don't know. If you don't beat yourself up. You probably don't use it too often. But I'm going to guess a lot of you, most of you, can't tell me whether this is valid, right? Gregor Gysi is president of the Federal Republic of Germany, so Gysi must be Catholic. Well, you would have to know, does the president of Germany have to be Catholic? You might think, well, probably not. That doesn't seem quite right. I don't know. That'd be weird if they had some religious requirement. Man, I don't know. I'm not German. Is it valid? Is it not? God only knows, right? Actually, not God only knows. I know it's not valid, but you have to know a whole lot about the German political system to know that this is not valid, right? And this was the same problem we ran into with our baseball argument, right? Well, Tigers beat the White Sox. So they must have scored more runs. If you know something about baseball, you're probably like, well, that's not the only way to win. If you know nothing about baseball, you might just be like, I have no idea. I mean, probably not valid. It seems like there ought to be other ways to win. I don't know. If you cheat or something, I don't know. But is it valid? Is it not? I don't know. Don't I have to know something about baseball to know whether this argument's valid? Isn't that a problem? Well, in fact, it is. And that's one of the reasons that we are going to need to learn more about this idea of validity to get a more precise concept of it and definition. Ideally, we don't need to know a thing at all about what the argument is talking about to tell whether it is valid. That's going to save us some work because we won't need to think about, the actual stuff going on, but we're going to need to take a few more steps to make the argument the idea of validity a bit more precise before we can do that. And look, in some cases, nobody might know whether an argument like this is valid, right? So I remember having an argument with a friend of mine in college. God, this is a nerdy argument. We had too much time on our hands. we were talking about Star Wars, and I'm like, well, Han Solo and Luke Skywalker are human. He's like, no, 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 they can't be human because their ancestors didn't evolve on Earth. Is that a valid argument or not? Again, I don't know that anybody can tell you. What is our concept of human being? If you look like a human being, have 46 chromosomes, red blood, all that stuff, are you a human? Do you have to have specific ancestors? I don't know. Another one, God is by definition the most perfect being, so he exists. Is this valid? Who knows, right? I mean, how do we define most perfect being? If we say by definition perfect beings have to exist, then yeah, I don't know. Who knows? So, how do we handle this? We handle this by spelling everything out. When we talk about an argument being valid, we want to spell out every single detail. And if an argument doesn't look valid, we spell it out until we can make it so. We fill in missing premises. We will talk a lot more about this, but we make the argument valid. Everything has to be explicit. We don't want to rely on any knowledge the person might or might not have. Really, when we focus on validity, we want to focus only on the principles we have in front of us. We ideally shouldn't have to bring in any knowledge outside of what they say. Everything has to be stated then. So, Gregor Gysi is president of the Federal Republic of Germany. Only Catholics can be president of Germany, so Gysi is Catholic. Now that we've spelled it out, if premise one is true, if he really is president, and if you have to be Catholic to be president of Germany, in the same way that you have to be 35 to be president of the US, could we know that this guy's Catholic? Yes. Now look, as I already said, he isn't. This premise isn't true. We'll come back to that. But now at least we have a valid argument. And as we get into formal logic, we will want to do this. We will want to spell out every single thing. And given what we have on the page in front of us, is there a way to accept these premises and reject the conclusion? We don't want to have to bring in things we might or might not know about baseball or German politics. We can make this a valid argument. All humans have ancestors who evolved on Earth. Han Solo doesn't have ancestors who evolved on Earth, so he isn't human. If we accept these premises that have been spelled out, could we think of a way that the conclusion's false? We couldn't. God is by definition the most perfect being. A being that exists is more perfect than one that doesn't. So if God doesn't exist, he would not be the most perfect being. This contradicts premise one, so God exists. This is a slightly more complex form of argument, but if we spell it out in this way, we know that it is in fact valid. Now that we've spelled out everything in the premises, we know the conclusion follows. So that is one thing as we get into formal logic you're going to need to do. You spell out everything in the argument. Now this brings me back to a point that I talked about before. Valid does not mean a good argument or a convincing one. An argument can be valid and a bad one. Well, how is that? There are actually a few different ways. I mean, think of the arguments we've already looked at, right? This one is a bad argument, right? Why is it a bad argument? Gysi is not president of Germany, and there's nothing in the German constitution that says you have to be Catholic to be president. So even if he were president, we wouldn't know that he's Catholic, right? You know, this one's valid. All humans have ancestors who evolved on Earth. But we don't know if it's a good argument because, well, this is exactly what me and my roommate were arguing about. To be a human, do you have to have ancestors who evolved on Earth? Who knows? Same with this one. Is it a good argument? Well, we still don't know because we don't know if premise 2 is true or not. To be a good argument, at the very least, a deductive argument has to be sound. What does that mean? That means that the argument is valid and it means it has all true premises. Let me give you some examples. All dogs are descended from wolves. Princess Pretty Paws is a dog. So Princess Pretty Paws is descended from wolves. This is sound, right? You know, all dogs are in fact descended from wolves. Know who Princess Pretty Paws is, but let's say she is in fact a dog. Picturing some frilly little dog, you know, probably right. Well, it's true, all dogs are descended from wolves. True, Princess Pretty Paws is a dog. So Princess Pretty Paws is descended from wolves, right? If these premises are true, the conclusion has to be true as well. Guess what? Premises are true. It is sound. It satisfies both parts of soundness. It is valid, and the premises are all true. This is valid but unsound. Gysi is president of the Federal Republic of Germany. No, he's not. Only Catholics can be president of Germany. No, that's not true. So Gysi must be Catholic. It's unsound because it has at least one untrue premise. In fact, it has two untrue premises, but it is valid. If these premises were true, if he were president of Germany, and if there were something in the Constitution that said president has to be Catholic, then he would have to be Catholic as well. But they're not true, so the argument is valid but unsound. Here is another valid but unsound argument. Moxie is a bird. I mean, maybe she is, maybe she isn't. But definitely 2 isn't true. All birds are actually robots created by the CIA and the Freemasons. I don't know. I forget exactly what that kid who is pushing the birds aren't real conspiracy was saying. I think part of it was they were robots. I don't know who he said created them, right? Anyway, premise 2 is obviously false. To my knowledge, no birds are robots, but even if some were, they obviously aren't all robots. I have seen cats take them apart. Suffice it to say, pretty good reasons to know they're not robots. Ergo, you know. But if these premises were true, if she is a bird and all birds are really robots, then she would have to be a robot too, right? Premise 2 is not only false, it's just flat stupid. But if it were true, the conclusion would have to be true as well. Now, we are not going to talk much or really any about soundness as we get into formal logic. You know, when we were talking about controversial or not controversial and questions like burden of proof when we were in informal logic, then we were dancing up close to this idea of soundness because we were asking, well, are the premises good or not? As we get into formal logic, I don't even want to think about, you know, whether the premises are true or not. I don't even want to think about, after a certain point, we're not even going to think about what they say. We'll say more about that next lecture. So soundness is not something we're going to talk about much or at all. Now, one thing I will mention is that even soundness might not mean that an argument is, by our normal standards, a good one. Soundness and validity are very precise concepts. They mean a very specific thing. Well, when we evaluate an argument as good, we might mean more than even soundness, right? This is certainly a valid argument. Han Solo is a much cooler character than Luke Skywalker. If that's true, then the conclusion has to be true as well, because the conclusion is just the premise restated. I think it's a sound argument. I think he is in fact cooler, but even if this is sound, it's not good because it doesn't give you any reason to believe the conclusion. When we say something's sound, we don't necessarily mean it's good. This might be sound, but even if it is, it's not convincing. This argument is also sound, but it's a bad one, right? Harrison Ford was the actor who played Han Solo. Harrison Ford was in Apocalypse Now, so was Marlon Brando. Ford was in The Fugitive, so was Tommy Lee Jones. Tommy Lee Jones was Al Gore's college roommate. Some people make fun of Gore because they say he claimed to have been in the internet. Everyone needs an internet connection these days. So the actor who played Han Solo was in Apocalypse Now. Right? I don't know. Maybe I should be more cautious with 8 and say most people need an internet connection. Even if I were, this argument is definitely valid. It's probably sound. It's a terrible argument because premises 3 through 8 have nothing to do with the conclusion. There's a lot of garbage information here. Nobody given this in day-to-day life would think it's a good argument. It's rambling, whatever. But it is sound because, again, soundness is a very precise concept that does not necessarily mean good. I would say all good deductive arguments are valid, all good deductive arguments are sound, but there are other things we might mean by a good argument. Just keep that in mind. To be a good argument, something has to be valid. If it's a deductive argument, it has to be sound, but there might be more things it needs. It might need to be convincing. This one's not. It might need to stay on topic. This one doesn't. But again, keep in mind the concept is very limited. Now, we will talk more about this next lecture. But one thing that helps me with validity is to think of it as a game. Don't bring in anything you know about the concept, but just imagine that you're playing a game with somebody and you say, look, I'm going to act as though everything you say is true, no matter how ridiculous. But if I accept what you say, no matter how ridiculous, if I can think of a way that I accept everything you say without granting the conclusion, then I win. And it can be really artificial, right? Imagine that this person says, well, everyone who falls 30,000 feet from a plane dies. Sarah fell 35,000 feet, so she died. You went, you said everyone who fell 30,000 feet. You didn't say everyone who fell 35,000. Not a valid argument. You lose, right? Now, in ordinary conversation, you'd be like, oh, for the goodness sakes, right? When we're playing this game of validity, then you have to be precise in that way. So the person says, well, everyone who falls 30,000 feet or more dies. She fell 35,000, that's more than 30, so she died. That might not be sound. As Van Cleve points out, there are some rare people who fall a really long way and miraculously survive. But if we granted that, well, everyone who does fall this much dies, and she did, then we would have to grant the conclusion. I don't know. This is really helpful for me to think of validity as a sort of game. Can you accept everything the other person says and still think of a way their conclusion might be false? If you can, then it's not valid. And if they can keep spelling out, if they can add enough conditions and kind of back you into a corner where you can't imagine a way that the conclusion's false while granting all these premises, then they've won, then the argument's valid. Doesn't necessarily mean it's good because it might not be sound, but again, I think it helps to think of validity as a game, and that is a way of thinking about it that I'm going to keep coming back to because it really helps me. All right, so like I said, helps me to think of it as a game. Next lecture, we will start learning some more precise rules for this game.